from a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, tips on hunkering down during the latest winter storms without yearning for the taste of human flesh.
Oh, dear.
And now, the podcast host who won't resort to cannibalism this winter because he's got himself an all-electric snowblower, Pete Dominic!
Oh, yes, indeed, sir. I do have the Ego snowblower, and I love it. I like it a lot, and it worked. We finally got some snow here in New York State. First time we've gotten any snow the entire winter. At least the first time I've had to pick up a shovel, and it's pretty depressing. But it was beautiful, the snow at least, and I got out there, and it was pretty wonderful. But a little bit too late. I mean, winter's almost over. Last day of Black History Month yesterday. Today is the first day of March. Welcome to March, everybody. It's the first day of Women's History Month, and I'm very happy to have you listening here to today's podcast. And as a salute to women's history, I have two men on today's show. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that it began today. But I do have two great guests, Dr. Peter Hotez, David Rothkopf. And I will have a lot of great women on the show this month, I'm sure. And we'll talk about women's history, and we'll talk about women's issues and equity and everything else that we always talk about. So thank you very much for joining me on today's show. I don't have much news here on the news segment that I normally do because today was shot. It was just shot. A lot went on. A lot didn't go on. I didn't get to it. But I have these two great guests and two excellent conversations. So I'm really happy to share both of them with you. Thank you very much to Rob Houston or Houston. I always forget to say how to pronounce your last name, Rob, but really nice email. He said, I should email more often. I always think about sending you an email, but I never do. And I was just thinking, I wish more people emailed me. So I can never get enough email. I know I don't reply to all of it, but I read almost every email I get from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Rob says, I'm going to try to do it more often. I recently raised my subscription level to $50 a month. Thank you, Rob. Wow. He said, I really think what you do is important and impactful. And while news subscriptions are certainly what we all want for you, I can be financially equivalent to a few $10 a month subscriptions. And I want to do that. He also said, I listen to a lot of podcasts, about 20 that post at least weekly. And Stand Up with Pete Dominic is right there at the top. The only one I put my money towards. Sorry, NPR. I think my dollars go further for you than for all others I might send them to. Seriously, if I won the lottery, I would start a media company with Stand Up Pete Dominic at the lead of it. Rob, wow, that really made my day. Thank you very much. I absolutely hope that you win the lottery. And welcome to all new subscribers, by the way. If you've recently subscribed and I haven't given you a shout out, I'm so sorry. Thank you to Danny Leher, who signed up yesterday. Leher. Thank you to Edward Keene, Kevin Comiga, Edward Schmitz, Adam Smith, Teresa Bartlett. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for signing up or re-signing up, if that's the case. I cannot do it without your paid subscription. Certainly not every day. Thank you to Aaron the Farmer, Adrian Allen, and Cassie Rice. You guys are awesome. I am so grateful to all of the longtime subscribers as well. It means so much to me. I love hosting this podcast. I love doing these interviews. Somebody said, it's overkill. It's too many people. It's too much content. Never, I say. You get to pick and choose what you like, and it will be there for you every day. Like I said, I really want to get right to my guests today because I think they're both so good. I had awesome conversations with both of them. Let's kick it off. Coming up, David Rothkopf. He has been pumping out some great articles over at the Daily Beast. We had a really interesting and I think very important conversation, but I'm going to start out with Dr. Peter Hotez. He, of course, is a vaccine scientist, an author. He has been combating the anti-science movement for a really long time. He's a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology at Texas Children's Hospital. He developed his own vaccine and has given out over 100 million doses in India. And he's just an amazing human being. He's got a new book coming out, which I'm very excited to get. You can pre-order it now It's called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, How Health Freedom Propaganda Endangers the World. We caught up yesterday and I think covered a lot of ground. I'm really happy to share this with you. He's on Twitter at Peter Hotez. It would mean a lot if you went out and told him on Twitter that you heard him here. I guarantee he'll see the tweet and appreciate it. So please do that. Let's kick it off right now with Dr. Peter Hotez.
I've learned through this pandemic not to have a thin skin. I learned to have a thick skin. It just, in the end, it works out in the wash anyway.
Well, I don't know what you mean by that, but how do you have a thick skin? Because you are such a high-profile guy now. You're still using social media, making regular appearances everywhere, and we're so grateful to have you. But how do you get through the day with all the abuse and negativity and venom?
Yeah, and it's not gotten better. It's gotten a lot worse. As COVID, has, I don't want to say it's subsided, but it has gone down a bit. It's sort of the aggression is gotten a lot worse, and there seems to be a lot of revisionist history going on right now. People forgetting how vaccines have saved so many lives, and how terrified everybody was during the pandemic, and now people want to turn around and try to blame the scientists and the healthcare providers and all of this kind of nonsense.
Well, remind us then how successful the vaccines have been, because I think that's pretty much the most important thing we can tell people.
Yeah, I mean, my friend and colleague Alison Galvani, who's a professor at Yale School of Public Health, did an analysis with the Commonwealth Fund together with colleagues, and her modeling exercise finds that mRNA COVID vaccines during this pandemic in the United States saved 3 million lives, and 18 million hospitalizations. That's pretty impressive. And my new book will come out this summer. Just came out on pre-order on Amazon, called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science. The scientist's warning finds also the opposite, that in the sense that those who refused a COVID vaccine lost their lives in massive numbers. In fact, my number is 200,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives during the Delta wave at the last half of 2021, early Omicron BA1, because they refused a COVID vaccine. They were victims of this anti-science activism or aggression. And that to me is just incredibly tragic. And, Pete, I became an MD Ph.D. scientist trained in New York in the 80s to become a vaccine scientist, because I thought that was the highest expression of science for humanitarian goals. And it never occurred to me that this would be flipped on its side and scientists would be attacked for making vaccines and this rise in anti-vaccine activism. I mean, 200,000 Americans died because they refused a COVID vaccine, because they were victims of the aggression. And those are not small numbers. I did a back of the envelope calculation. You know how many Americans die in gun violence in 2021 and 2022?
What is it?
About 90 to 100,000 over those 2 years. And that's really, the number always comes out the same. And deaths from suicide, 90 to 100,000. Deaths from road traffic accidents, 90 to 100,000. So twice that are the deaths of Americans who decided not to take a COVID vaccine. And so I call anti-science one of the great societal killing forces. And as I say, they were victims of the aggressors, that, from everywhere from elected officials to Fox News that aired anti-vaccine content every day, in the last half of 2021, and convinced Americans not to take a vaccine. And that was documented by Media Matters, a watchdog group together with a social science group based in Europe at
ETH. I never said this.
It's just incredible.
I never said this publicly, but I will. No big deal. I used to be very close friends with Will Cain, who is one of the big stars now over at Fox. And I saw him questioning vaccines on Fox and Friends. And I reached out to him privately and, I pleaded with him, and I'll just say it's the last time we spoke. I was just so heartbroken because, that's the kind of thing
certainly can end a friendship. And you've seen so much. And I just want to say, first of all, the book is linked in the show notes. You can pre-order it now. And I just want to say, you all obviously know, and you've been given, awards by your peers, but there's millions of ordinary Americans that have gotten to know you. I certainly have over the years. And we just are all so grateful to you and your work. You actually created a vaccine that saved millions of lives. What's the update on that?
We're now at we're almost at 100 million doses administered.
Wow.
In India and Indonesia. So in India, the vaccine is known as Corbevax. In Indonesia, it's known as Indavac. And this is our recombinant protein COVID vaccine technology. We developed at our Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital in Baylor. And yeah, I think we provided proof of concept. You don't have to be a big pharma company to still do big things. So that was really encouraging to see. That's gratifying, very gratifying. So, a lot of mixed emotions during this pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, everything from, finding a lot of meaning in making vaccines and trying to combat the anti-vaccine activism, but also the aggression is just so frightening at times. And, I never thought I'd have to bring in the Texas Medical Center Police Department and the Houston Police Department and the Anti-Defamation League, because there's a lot of anti-Semitism with it as well. And that's a shocker.
How have you had to bring in law enforcement for one threat, for multiple threats?
It's pretty regularly, unfortunately. It's mostly online, and but there's been some physical stalkings too, and I don't like to talk about it too much, but it is, it's now I've got to ensure every time I speak somewhere, I've got to ensure there's security there, adequate security, and it's got to be checked. And the key is to try not to let it. Well, the two things you try to do: one, not let it try to alter your lifestyle and what you do, and second, not to let it, fuck with your head, because it does that too.
I just can't. I've gone through just a tiny amount, and it broke me. And now I worry that I won't ever be able to get an in-person. My shed is very well secured here, Dr. Hotez. I hoped someday you could step into the shed and we could do it. Although I've never actually interviewed someone in here, because if you were ill with any kind of virus, you'd be sure to get it in this 70 square feet. Moving on. So, a couple of the big controversies lately that I know you've had. I mean, I'm guessing that your interview requests have gone through the roof, given this new study on the effectiveness of masks and the way that's been misinterpreted. And, of course, the new information, whatever it is, we don't know, from the Department of Energy saying that they think it might have been a lab leak COVID. I'm guessing you're in high demand. So, thanks for joining me. Everybody's calling, yes?
Well, it's funny. And if you'd asked me a few days ago, I would say pretty much the interviews had really dropped off. With the change of the year, people just lost interest in COVID, and so now I've got a little more time to do other projects and do some additional writing and more time in the lab meetings and things. But then all of a sudden, since that Wall Street Journal headline article came out over the weekend, it's been pretty crazy again, with claims that the lab leak is back on the table.
So what do you want to say about that?
Well, I say it this way. I mean, there's two published papers in Science Magazine, which is one of the top scientific journals, by colleagues of mine. And they, clearly identify that this pandemic began as a cluster of cases around a wet market in Wuhan, where they had live animals, and even identified it to which side of the market is on, where the live animals were, and exotic animals that they use in wet markets. If you've ever been to one of these wet markets, I used to work in China years ago, not for virology, but for our work on parasitic infections. They're pretty horrible places. I mean, really, oftentimes keeping these animals in inhumane conditions, and these weird exotic animals like civet cats and raccoon dogs, and they can carry coronaviruses. So the coronaviruses pass from bats to humans either directly or through the second intermediate animal hosts. And that's how the original SARS in 2002 started out of a wet market from civet cats and in 2002. And so guess what? The same thing happened again in 2019, a cluster of cases around a wet market, probably linked to those intermediate animal hosts. And that to me explains the origins of COVID-19. And so when I, hear that the energy labs are looking at classified data of low confidence. First of all, I don't even know what that means. I'm not an intelligence guy. I don't know what low confidence means.
Yeah,
I mean, it sounds like it's got an asterisk on it.
Well, and the headline gets a little bit misinterpreted. The Wall Street Journal put out the story, and the headline said Energy Department believes lab leak theory or whatever it was. But then you read into it, and it's like they call it, as you said, we don't know, we don't speak intel, but it's low confidence, and then there's a few levels at least above that. So I think the headline certainly is misleading.
But I don't understand. I mean, let's say, the place that people often want to make claims where there's the virus was manufactured, which we know wasn't the case, or the lab leak. They claim it was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is about 10 kilometers away from the wet markets and across the other side of the river. What I can't reconcile is if you're postulating a lab leak, how is it that you would see the cluster of cases by the wet market? You would think if it came out of the lab, then lab staff would have carried the virus wherever they live, right? And there'd be clusters, there'd be a kind of a random cluster of cases all over Wuhan. And yet that's not what they see. So I don't even know how to reconcile the possibility of a lab leak in light of the published papers that are in Science Magazine showing that cluster of cases. Unless, the only thing that I would say is they do say they have access to classified data, but I can say from the publicly available data that the lab leak doesn't make sense to me.
I wonder about this story. I'm trying to be critical of my own bias around it, and why do I think what I think? And the reason I think what I think about such stories is because I basically just look at kind of the aggregate of the scientists who I've grown to respect, who have been right about things the vast majority of their career. I look at their interests and so on. And I don't sit here and try to research every point of view or chase one down. So where my biases are is generally where the evidence is that at least has been shared. And a lot of that is really hard for people who don't do science to understand. But my question to you is, why is this important? Why is it important from the science's point of view as to where an outbreak began?
Well, it's important because, remember, this is the third major coronavirus epidemic / pandemic of the 21st century. We had SARS in 2002, severe acute respiratory syndrome. That was devastating. It started in southern China, affected Toronto. It took bringing the Rolling Stones to Toronto to get the economy back. And I don't know how much longer we can count on the Rolling Stones to rescue us. And then in 2012, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome started. So that's why we started working on coronavirus vaccines 10, 12 years ago, because we saw SARS and MERS and said, you know what, there's going to be a third one. And guess what? There was a third one that was COVID-19. And now I'm saying, you know what? We still don't really understand at a granular level how these viruses jump from bats to humans or through second intermediate animal hosts. We've never really done the outbreak investigation in central China that needs to be done. So without that understanding, I don't see what prevents a fourth one from coming up. I mean, Mother Nature's telling us what she has in mind. She's hurling a major coronavirus pandemic at us every 7 years. 2002, 2012, 2019. So I think before the end of the decade, we're going to have a fourth major coronavirus epidemic, pandemic, which hopefully it won't be as bad as COVID-19, but maybe it'll be worse than COVID-19. And that's what we need to focus on. We need to have all hands on deck understanding the origins of this at a very granular level, which we don't. We have to have the surveillance mechanism in place. We have to have the virologists feel empowered to do the studies they need, because if the fourth one's coming, we need to get ready for it.
One of the concerns is that scientists...
And by the way, it's not just coronavirus, right? We have this still thing called H5N1 flu and zoonotic influenzas and Nipah virus. And this is happening because of a lot of changed social determinants and climate change and everything else. So This is a new normal, and we're just not doing the pandemic preparedness. We're spinning our wheels with all of the crazy conspiracies.
That is so disheartening to hear, but I am inspired that there are amazing people like you on the case. Just real quick, you mentioned a couple of these other viruses. We've, of course, been familiar with other outbreaks throughout history, especially in Asia. But it's my understanding that sometimes it takes up to a decade to trace back where an outbreak began. And even then, you're not necessarily positively sure. So is it fair to say that we might never know?
It's a possibility, especially because the Chinese authorities destroyed the wet market and, covered up the evidence. And so people, complain about the lack of transparencies of the Chinese government. I totally get that. But the lack of transparency, I think, is not so much covering up a lab leak or that, but more, after SARS in 2002, the Chinese government was supposed to put a halt to all the wet markets. That was the deal. And clearly they didn't do that. And now the world paid the price for that as well. I mean, it's, China is this, if you ever been to China, it's a really unique place. It's a fascinating place, but especially in the rural areas, even though they're rural, you still have very high population density. And you have, this menagerie of ducks and geese and pigs and this provides a perfect mixing bowl for influenza viruses to reassort and other viruses to reassort. And that's why we see so many of these viruses emerge out of these high density population areas in China.
I didn't know that they had agreed to get rid of the wet markets, but that
was my understanding. And that clearly was not the case.
I wanted to ask you about this other story that's gotten a lot of attention. Someone came on my show yesterday. He's a comedian, and we were talking about, people's differences and how do you deal with stuff. And he mentioned something about this new study about masks. And he said, the New York Times said the masks didn't work, full stop. And I said, yeah, Greg Fitzsimmons, comedian, I'm just going to go ahead and say that's not true. I think there was some misinterpretation there. It was my understanding. But the truth is, a column written by a conservative columnist who gets a lot of things wrong and has to walk them back and be fact-checked, named Bret Stephens, basically came away with that conclusion. And I guess there was somebody on the study who maybe supported that. But then I read another column looking at that from a guy who I highly respect, Michael Hiltzik, who's been writing for years at the LA Times, who writes, COVID deniers claim a new study says mask mandates don't work. They should try reading the study. What is this all about?
So I actually like a lot of Bret Stephens stuff. I've never met him. I've spoken to Hiltzik. He's a good journalist. But I've never spoken or interacted with Bret Stephens, although I like a lot of his stuff. Some of it I don't agree with. Why he decided to focus on this thing, I don't know. He doesn't usually
for sure.
He doesn't usually do health and COVID. I haven't seen. I mean, he's more, Israel politics and that kind of thing. So I was surprised that he did it, and he seemed to latch on to what's called a Cochrane analysis, which is a certain analytic tool that's used to compare and contrast multiple studies in what's sometimes called a meta-analysis, to look at kind of an overarching analysis of all the studies. And the Cochrane methodology is an interesting one. Some people like to call it a gold standard. I've never thought of it that way. It's just one tool. And my understanding of this particular Cochrane analysis is it's comparing studies that use multiple different types of masks, everything from N95s to simple surgical masks. So that can cause skew some of the results in one direction or another, because the surgical masks are just not as good as N95s. And then I think the others is there are certain studies that were excluded that shouldn't have been excluded in the Cochrane analysis, according to some people. The point is, the Cochrane analysis has value, but it's not a gold standard. And I think the mistake was he put it out there as a gold standard and didn't really explain that, yes, N95 still work and prevent transmission of COVID. So it was unfortunate. And the editors in the New York Times should have kind of put the brakes on it, or at least said, hey, Brett, maybe you want to, or show it to a scientist, right? And say, hey, maybe you want to rethink this guy. And so I got frustrated because, these are our flagship newspapers, Pete, right? New York Times, Wall Street Journal. If we can't depend on these guys, that's not good. So to have this happen twice in 1 week gives me pause for concern. We need our journalists to hang in there with us. They've been good during the pandemic overall. I mean, I can't even tell you the number of journalists I've spoken to, but you figure it out every day, 3 or 4 times a day for 3 years. That's a few thousand journalists, and the vast majority do not have a science background. And overall, I've been deeply impressed how hard they've worked to get it right. And I think many of them are, they're overall, I think the community of journalists are unsung heroes, but every now and then this kind of stuff happens.
Well, I always feel like you're never given enough time, or that these issues are just hard for the public to understand. And so, a lot of on television, especially, the ratings are what matters. You certainly keep people's attention, and I think that's one reason why people like to talk to you. But people's interest in these issues, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, comes and goes. But I hope mine never does, and I'm always glad to talk with you. So I want to ask you, where are we now with COVID in the U.S. or around the world? Well,
the this latest variant that's dominant, XBB 1.5, seems to be slowly going down. And the interesting thing is, just with every other variant that we've had, as this one goes down, you start to see another one start to pick up steam, so that it goes in waves. This time around, so far, knock on whatever you want to knock on wood, I am not seeing another big variant pop up. So, is this, I do this weekly call with some great colleagues, people like Mike Osterholm, who's a brilliant epidemiologist, Eric Topol, and Peggy Hamburg. And we're just wondering, is this it? Is this going to be the last gasp for a while? And I don't think we know. So far it's looking somewhat promising, but we'll see. The summers have been bad times here in the southern states when we've had other waves, and we'll see about next winter. So the key, I think, is to not spike the ball on the 10-yard line just yet. So by that I mean, those of you who've gotten the bivalent booster back in September, now it's getting on 5-6 months. I think it's maybe time for a second bivalent booster, but we've not heard that from the CDC or FDA. So I'd like them to talk about that. I think the next big question is, what about those annual boosters? Remember, we heard a few weeks ago that they were going to promote this idea of, they were kind of making a rough comparison between COVID and flu, and there's going to be an annual booster. When are we going to hear about that? Is it going to be as we head into the summer? And then I think if all the stars align and we don't see another big COVID wave in the coming months, then I think what we need to do is really transition to a greater pandemic preparedness effort to get ready for the next big one, whether it's going to be the 4th major coronavirus pandemic or a zoonotic influenza or some other virus. And that's going to be the hardest to keep everyone's attention, because we're so reactive instead of, visionary. And especially now with all the toxic stuff going on in Congress, can we get people to reach across the aisle and come together with a pandemic strategy? Because we've seen how COVID-19, the public health element, is just one aspect. It destroys economies, it unravels securities and governments. And so, treating pandemic threats with the same attention that we treat military threats, that's going to be I think one of the big challenges. Sounds good to me. Sounds like a really good bet to me. I'm all for that investment. Did you see Woody Harrelson on Saturday Night Live and his comments? No, I heard about it after the fact. It sounded horrible, but per the kind of criticism that he was making, he basically calling all the pharmaceutical companies the biggest drug cartel in the world, because I guess they all collude around these vaccines, and then they force us to take these drugs.
is basically, kind of what he said. But my question to you is around the pharmaceutical companies and what they may, be charging or even making on these vaccines. And obviously you funded yours differently. And I know that you don't want to necessarily be, out there criticizing. You want to be the solution, which is good vaccines that work. And that's what these pharmaceutical companies have created. Yet I just wanted to get your take on how much they should be costing us and how, governments should be subsidizing that, because I know that's another issue that people had concerns with, is that some of the aid is running out and people are now going to have to maybe pay for those vaccines.
Well, my understanding is together Pfizer and Moderna got $30 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars, $30 billion. And that was both for development costs given to Moderna as well as the advanced purchase for the vaccines. So then we heard they want to go up to $130 a dose. And you want to just say, guys, dial it down. I mean, you just got $30 billion and now you want to quadruple the price. I mean, do you not think people are not going to take that very well? And so
how much of that do you think has
I'm always in this balance, because people want to be quick to demonize the pharma companies, and I get that. And what I say is, look, I'd rather not demonize the pharma companies. They do good and they provide a lot of vaccines for the world. My take, though, is we should broaden the whole pharmaceutical and vaccine ecosystem to bring in, introduce other players like us and like the developing country vaccine manufacturers that can also provide a lot of innovation. I think there's too much of a velvet rope around the pharma companies, and I want to say that in a way not to demonize them, at the same time recognize that we realize that we can't rely on the pharma companies for everything.
Do you think there's a lot of policy makers at any level that understand that there are outfits like yours and other universities and other scientists developing vaccines, and if we could get government funding for them, that would be great, and to get around that velvet rope? Because obviously they donate to campaigns, and we could get into campaign finance and so on. But I mean, do policymakers understand that?
Well, I've seen Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders people, shake their fist and express indignation, or even Robert Reich, who I have a lot of time for, to which I say, well, come talk to us, right? I mean, rather than just shaking your fist at the pharma companies, come and look at what are some alternatives that could be out there. And that's what we don't get. We get the indignation and people get pissed off, but then they don't seem to understand that there may be options out there for alternatives.
Can't thank you enough, man, for all the work you're doing, and obviously for talking to me. Anything else you want to add, or I'll let you go?
I think that's it. Just thank you for giving me a voice and attention to all of this, and you've just been such a stalwart throughout this whole pandemic, and appreciate it. Well,
and long before, because I've been paying attention to your work for a really long time, and I've always been very grateful that I get the opportunity to talk to you. So keep it up. Best to your family, and I hope to talk to you again soon, my friend.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, there he goes. How about it? Professor Peter Hotez. He has won a lot of awards this year. Just won another award. I forgot to mention that, but I congratulated him before I hit record. Definitely go pre-order his book right now. It's The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, How Health Freedom Propaganda Endangers the World. And let him know that you heard him here on the show by heading over to Twitter. He will see your tweet, and I will appreciate that you mentioned that you heard him here. Does a lot of interviews, so that matters. All right, joining me now is an expert on foreign policy, national security, political affairs, and more. He's the founder, and CEO of TRG Media, the Rothkopf Group, columnist for the Daily Beast, a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, author of 10 books, including, most recently, American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation, just out this past November. He's on Twitter, where he's awesome at DJ Rothkopf. You should listen to his podcast, Deep State Radio. I'm always so happy when I get the opportunity to talk to him. We covered a lot of ground, from Ukraine and Russia to Jimmy Carter to the upcoming election, Dilbert, and so much more. Let's do it.
David Rothkopf joins me again, one of our favorite people to talk to. Thank you very much for agreeing to allow me to tape our conversation.
This is going to be recorded?
It always is. I always record these.
Yes, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Sorry, I thought that was implied. So lots to talk with you about. Obviously, a year of war in Ukraine, and you've written the most interesting article I think I've read, and I've read many about it because a lot of things that we learned that others haven't written about. But I got to ask you just quickly before we jump into that. Dilbert, the comic strip, and is written by a guy named Scott Adams, and you've heard the comments he's made, and that Elon Musk kind of came and supported him. But those comments were so sad to me, David, about him saying, like, just don't be around black people. We're so far through the looking glass that it really made me very kind of like my reaction was just sadness. How are you seeing where we're at with these types of comments being made by people like him?
Well, racist douchebags will be racist douchebags, and this is not something that they ever get out of their system. And this guy has been one for a long time. I don't know. Do you see his most recent comment?
Maybe not.
There was a tweet I saw not too long ago in which he said, that he was discriminated against at 3 different jobs and let go for racism, 2 others at his cartooning job. And that's why for several years of his life, he identified as black.
Oh, I just... Well,
I mean, really? Really? That's your response to this whole thing? And then, on the other hand, how much damage can this guy do? Like, who reads Dilbert anyway? On the other hand, Elon Musk said, oh, yeah, I agree with this guy.
Yeah.
And white people are discriminated against in the media. And that's racist code. It's an incredibly racist thing to say. And, he's a government contractor. He is, controls a very important large media platform. And you got to wonder, when an advertiser writes a check to Twitter, are they going, oh, yeah, let's support the racist? Or when the U.S. federal government says, yeah, let's use our taxpayer dollars. Hope none of those black people taxpayer dollars go to Elon Musk. It's disgusting.
In your piece at the Daily Beast, one of the things about the year of war that you mention, 10 Surprising Lessons of Ukraine War, everybody should read it. You write, with friends like Turkey, Israel, the Global South, and Elon Musk, who needs enemies? I thought that was a really interesting point. I hadn't seen as many people be made because a lot has been laid bare here. And you mentioned countries and individuals. We've seen them take, maybe not surprising, but we've seen them take sides, and that matters, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, they've taken sides and not our side, and not just not our side, not the side of, innocent people or justice or international law. And they've all done it for typically very narrow, self-interested reasons. The Israelis have certain ties to the Russians due to certain flows of Russian immigrants. Some of the countries in OPEC, in which Russia plays, are looking out for Russian interests there. The Turks want to have it both ways all the time. And Elon Musk has been doing dealings with the Russians. Now, everybody's entitled to take their own opinion, but we're allowed to have our opinion of them. And if Elon Musk is, making a deliberate, conscious decision not to help the Ukrainians defend themselves by using his technologies, he's denying them the use of his technologies in order to defend themselves, then we have to define that as saying he is acting against the interests of the United States, against the interests of NATO. Why are we contracting with him? Why are we spending important dollars associated with critical defense programs like space with a guy who is clearly on the other side on some of the big political issues of our time?
Well, because his technology works. That Starlink is pretty effective. I guess that's why. If there was something else, wouldn't we partner with them? Or how dare you attack Elon Musk?
Yeah, no, you're right. And I understand why you would defend him. But But the reality is that there are plenty of technologies out there that we could use, and if we wanted to invest in them, we could equal what he is doing. After all, Elon Musk never invented a damn thing. Despite his own mythology, right. All Elon Musk does is buy companies. He doesn't have the only space company. He doesn't have the only electric car company. So let's get a grip, okay? It's he's just a rich kid who inherited a bunch of money, who's invested in a bunch of companies in a kind of a ruthless way, and that's the way it works. But I don't think our government has to support a guy like that.
On the Sunday shows, I watch all of them, so you don't have to. It's like they were talking a lot about F-16s, and there's an interesting argument that it basically goes with all these weapon technology. Ukraine says we need it, and the Biden administration says you can't have it yet, and then eventually gives it to them, whether it be missiles or tanks or Patriot missiles, whatever. Eventually, they give it to them. So why aren't they currently training Ukraine pilots to fly F-16s eventually? That was how it all went on the Sunday shows with the president's national security advisor and so on. I ask you, Rothkopf, you know better than anybody else. F-16s, should we give them to the president of Ukraine? He's asked for them.
Probably, but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in the war. First of all, it'll take a long time to train people up to be able to fly the F-16s. The supply chains necessary to support them are going to be complicated. So whatever we would give them will be of limited impact. There are other things they need a lot more, like ammunition, what they call tubes, the barrels of cannons and howitzers, and missiles that go long distances. And, I think the administration, and if you listen to all those shows, that's what you heard Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, say.
Right.
We are providing them with what we think they need. And the president of the United States used to say we will not supply them with F-16s. He doesn't say that anymore. And the reason he doesn't say that anymore is that probably sooner or later we will.
In your article, you say that it's unnamed aircraft that have stolen the show. I haven't paid that close attention, but apparently drone warfare is where we're at in this day and age.
Yeah, unmanned aircraft is what you meant there, yes. And that's right. The Russian attack last night on Ukraine was drone attack. The Russians have found themselves victims of drones that the Ukrainians got from the Turks called Bayraktar drones. There's even a song, if you Google it, that the Ukrainians started singing a song about the Bayraktar drones. And a lot of this war has been preview of wars to come, because the reality is, why put a human being in a vulnerable weapon when you don't have to, when you can guide it from afar? And it not only does it not bode well for fighter pilots of the future. Tom Cruise could be the last one, but the same is true with ships. They sank some big ships using drones and missiles. Ships are big sitting ducks most of the time.
Yeah, you read about the current and future of naval warfare. But you also have an article about President Biden going to Ukraine. It is titled, Biden's trip to Kiev is the ultimate humiliation for Putin. And you also say that Putin probably doesn't have long. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of Joe Biden. We all saw him go there and travel on a train, and it was apparently an arduous journey, and he could have been killed anytime. Apparently they told the Russians where he was or that he was going because, why not? I guess. I don't know why those things happen, but why was his trip so important?
Well, first of all, those things happen because, they work. You tell the other side, don't shoot a missile at a train that's got the president on it, because if you kill the president of the United States, you will start World War III. The Russians don't want to do that. Him going there was extremely important because it sent a message. It says, we're committed. The West is committed. Putin was the one who wanted to be walking the streets, and I'm the one who's walking these streets. I'm not afraid. Sent a message back home politically. It said, I'm vigorous. I'm in charge. And the Ukrainians said that it was a huge morale boost to the people who were out there in trenches fighting and dying. And, for all those reasons, it was the right thing to do. And then he went to Warsaw, Poland. He gave a speech to 30,000 people. They cheered him like a rock star because they see him as essentially, as the leader of the West in all of this. And, it evoked both of these trips, John F. Kennedy going to the Berlin Wall and saying, Ich bin ein Berliner, looking at the Russians and saying, we're here, we stand with the West. Ronald Reagan going to the Berlin Wall and saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. This is going to stand with that. It's going to stand with the U.S.'s best moments of being an ally of Europe and a defender of democracy.
He looked pretty strong. There can be no doubt about that. Even a lot of his critics were supporting that visit. He looked really strong even the other night in his interview with David Muir. I was pretty impressed with the way he was handling all these questions. It seems like he's done a pretty darn good job vis-a-vis Ukraine. But you gotta wonder, I always wonder, how long the American public will support this war and our money going to it. Increasingly isolationist, obviously Republicans. And you hear all this propaganda from right-wing media, obviously not telling the truth about any of it. And we have a short attention span. We don't love spending money on wars, and we don't. I mean, what do you think? That's certainly what Putin is. That's his whole wager, is that the American people will stop supporting Ukraine and the West will stop supporting Ukraine. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a risk. But look, first of all, although our support has been enormous, $30 billion in military aid, $30 billion in military aid isn't that much for us. And when you look at it purely in U.S. terms, not in the terms of the much, much greater commitment and cost that Ukraine has entailed, the reality is Russia was one of our likely adversaries. Today, half of their military is destroyed. Each day, 800, 900, 1,000 of their soldiers die. Their stock of weapons is depleted. Their international standing is depleted. They are weakened. The likelihood that they will be able to mount another such attack is diminished, all for a fairly limited cost to the United States and the West. The real brunt of the cost is the Ukrainians, who are losing thousands and thousands of their own people. And if you look at some of the pictures of the cities the Russians have devastated, cities that are being wiped off the map. But for us, it's in our interests. It's a bargain for taking care of an enemy and reducing our risks. And after all, that's what our national security priority is. It's to make ourselves safer. And this is an investment that makes us safer.
You also say that the most important lesson of all, and it will be the remainder of the century, is that everything is always about China. I demand you explain yourself. People should go read it at the Daily Beast, but I demand you explain yourself now.
First of all, when I say everything is about China, I mean everything is about every major U.S. policy issue today is about China.
Agriculture, economic, technology,
absolutely,
energy,
absolutely,
healthcare,
yes,
democracy.
Yes.
Love Island, the reality show.
I wouldn't call that a major U.S. policy issue.
You said everything, though.
No, well, I really was referring to the policy realm. You're right. It doesn't pertain to that. Okay. It doesn't pertain to...
Looks like I nailed you.
You really did. You really did. But the reality, you talk about labor policy, where do jobs go? Who are we competing with? You talk about economic growth. Who are our big trade partners? Who are we competing with? If you talk about science, technology, trade, climate, health, pandemics, any international issue, who's the big country that we have to deal with? It's always China. And now in this particular case, if China makes the decision that they're going to go and provide lethal aid to Russia in this war in a big way, which the administration has said they have not made that decision yet. But if they were to do that, it would be a game changer for the Russians. And if they don't do it, it will also be a game changer for the Russians. If they just provide them a few weapons, but really leave the Russians out there hanging because they don't think it's a good investment to be involved in this war, the message to the world is clear that China is, putting a brave face on their Russian alliance, but behind the scenes they're unhappy. And by the way, I think that's where we are right now.
That's where we are right now with Russia.
I think the Chinese are disheartened, that they've picked this ally as their so-called best friend, and they've gone into this illegal war. They've lost. They've been weakened. They have committed war crimes. They have threatened, to use nuclear weapons, what the Chinese have communicated clearly to the Russians would be a disaster. And Chinese leadership for 5,000 years always been about self-interest of China. What about this war helps China? Nothing.
It's hard to see how it is in any way helpful. It's a headache at least, and a disaster at worst, I suppose.
I think it's a disaster. I think it really screws up their international standing. They bet on the wrong partner.
Yet I'm still so surprised to see the right-wing media be so anti-Ukraine all the time, and many in Congress. Not so many in the Senate. I think there's maybe one or two Republicans in the Senate who are not supporting Ukraine, but
it's weird. I grew up in a country where Russia was the evil bogeyman. You look at a movie, the Russians were the bad guys. When Rocky had to go fight somebody, who did he fight? It was a Russian, right? Drago or whatever. Wasn't that
Ivan Drago? Red Dawn was
Red Dawn, another movie where Patrick Swayze had to protect us all
and Charlie Sheen. Don't forget Charlie Sheen.
Yeah. But they were just evil. They were like the Nazis were in the movies. And that these people are embracing this guy after everything, right? All we've been seeing for a year is war crimes, stealing thousands of Ukrainian children, blowing up maternity hospitals, murdering people in cold blood. And they're like, yeah, we have nothing against the Russians. They reveal a ton about who they are. They embrace Russia because, like them, the Russians are nationalists. They're racist. They anti-gay. They have the same agenda. They're authoritarian. Yeah. They're anti-democratic, and they don't like globalization. They don't like the threat to sort of hundreds of year old ideals of nationalism, and they're on the same side because they believe in those things, and because they think it allows them to be on the opposite side from Joe Biden and the Democrats. But make no mistake about it, they are betraying their national interests when they do it.
Well said. Say a word or two about Jimmy Carter. You had a really interesting piece about Jimmy Carter at the Daily Beast. Jimmy Carter was actually a very good foreign policy president, is what you're saying. We were talking about foreign policy, obviously. You had a lot to say here about the former president who's just announced that he is, headed into the twilight. What do we not know about what Jimmy Carter did in terms of foreign policy? Because I think most people remember the whole Iran issue and those helicopters going down in the desert and what that led to. People don't think as much about his foreign policy. I certainly don't until reading your article. And of course, Jonathan Alter's good book about him.
Well, the reality is that the Republican Party sought to bring down Jimmy Carter and raise up Ronald Reagan. And to do so, they had to lie about both men. And the lies that they perpetuated about both men have led us to where we are today. On the Jimmy Carter side of the equation, I think it's all quite clear now, about a half century later, that Jimmy Carter was probably the best man who we will see as president in our lifetime. The most virtuous, the one who lived up to his ideals in every aspect of his life, for every minute of his life, from when he grew up, when he was in the Navy, when he was a Sunday school teacher, when he was a farmer, when he was a governor, when he was a president, when he was ex-president. The other thing about Jimmy Carter was that, they said, well, he wasn't a very good president. Well, actually, he was a pretty good president. He won the Nobel Prize for the Camp David Accords, which actually were an important breakthrough in peace in the Middle East. He oversaw the handing back of the Panama Canal in a smooth and honorable fashion, which was a very important step to healing wounds with Latin America. He was the one that naturalized U.S. relations with China and began, the relationship that to this day is the most important in foreign policy. He said, he was the one buffeted with the energy crises of the 70s and said, we need to be energy independent. We need to find alternative means of energy. Of course, was a nuclear engineer from the Navy, and he understood those things. Right. He put solar panels on the White House, and of course, Reagan snarkily, took them down because, who would want clean energy? But, Carter, faced an economic crisis, and it was Carter who put in place Paul Volcker, who launched the attacks on inflation. They didn't take hold while Carter was in office. They took hold 2 months after he left office in March. And that's like the Iran deal. The hostages were gotten out of Iran by negotiations that took place under Carter.
Right.
But they wanted to keep them there until 30 minutes after Carter left office and Reagan took office. There's some very good books and articles that suggest that perhaps the Reagan team played a role in keeping those hostages there. But set that aside for a moment. If you look at all of these things, you see a guy who did a good job in very difficult times, coming out of Watergate, coming out of the end of the Vietnam War. And on the other hand, you've got Reagan, who came out on the other side of it and was, not the genial guy he was made out to be. We now have him on tape making racist cracks. He was a not good guy, even to his own family. Some of the time he was a lousy manager. He was disconnected. He didn't really know what was going on. He did not cut the size of government, despite what he said. It grew under him. He did not cut the deficit. It grew under him. He cut taxes for the rich, and inequality started to grow under him in ways that we'd never seen before and have continued through to this day. He claims credit, or his supporters say he was responsible for somehow bringing down the Soviet Union. He had very little to do with that. The Soviet Union was on its last legs when he came in.
How dare you?
It was
tarnish Ronald Reagan's legacy like that.
Well,
on my show.
I think it's important that we do, because it was Ronald Reagan that put us on the path to the extremist, divided politics of today.
Yeah.
And there is a straight line from Ronald Reagan to Lee Atwater and George H.W. Bush's campaigns, to Newt Gingrich, to the Tea Party, to Trumpism. Yep. And they all contain the same elements of serving the rich, dividing the country, racism, and lies, deceptions.
So well said. It's so important to have the more accurate history. It's a great article. Everybody should read as well. Before I let you go, speaking of some of the older guard, whether it be Republican or anyone else, I mean, I'm hearing from a lot of people reading. It makes it sound like they're texting me. I'm just seeing a lot of like old guard Republicans and others, conservatives, kind of expressing shock and dismay over Jeb Bush supporting Ron DeSantis. And I wonder, I just wanted to ask you about, the race as it stands right now. It's starting to heat up. You've got Nikki Haley stepping in and not wanting to criticize former President Trump at all, which is just, he's going to eat her alive. And yet she won't say anything. But what do you think about, a Jeb Bush supporting Ron DeSantis and where we're at? Are you going to CPAC, Rothkopf? Are you attending Matt Schlapp Fest? Should be interesting.
No.
I used to go to that. I went like 3 times for Sirius XM.
Doesn't Schlapp sound like a Yiddish word for self-abuse?
It sounds like a terrible name.
It's like, oh, yeah, he's slapping right now.
It sounds like a terrible name if you've been alleged of anything.
Yeah, no, really, it's bad. The reality is, who knows where this stuff is going to go. Jeb Bush was a giant flop, so I hope a little of that rubs off on Ron DeSantis. I get the impression there's still a bunch of people who are reading 2-year-old newspapers. and people like Jeb Bush. And the 2-year-old newspaper goes, well, Ron DeSantis, he's a smarter version of Donald Trump, or he's taking the rough edges off of Trumpism. Of course, in the past 2 years, we've learned he is a fascist. He's burning books. He is, promoting "Don't Say Gay." He is banning African American history. He is, kicking people out of government who don't agree with him. He is terrible. But they don't seem to have gotten the memo, and they also seem to think that they're sort of making a strong statement by saying, I'm not for Donald Trump. And somebody's got to send the message, hey, guys, the reason you've lost these elections is not Donald Trump. It's because you're racists. It's because you support the rich over the poor. It's because you lie. It's because you support Russia. It's because you support guns when everybody wants something reasonable done about guns. It's because you want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. It's those are the reasons you're losing. It's because you're fascist, anti-democratic, and corrupt. That's why we're opposing you. And if Ron DeSantis is all those things, he will lose. And I believe that that's the case. And I believe Nikki Haley will lose to both of them within the Republican Party. She's not criticizing Trump because she still thinks there's a shot. She could be the vice presidential candidate. But, this is a long, long way out. Right now, if you're a betting person, you have to say the person most likely to be the next president of the United States is the current president of the United States. He's probably not going to run opposed. He is probably going to have a decent economy behind him. He is going to spend the next 2 years touting his accomplishments and implementing them. And the Republican Party is going to eat each other in a, nasty display of their worst traits. So that would be my guess right now.
I think you're probably right. It's early, but do you see my boy Pompeo heating up, huh? No.
He is so awful.
That's why I have all my money on him, because he's so awful. Like that cruelty is the point. He's so mean and terrible. He loves himself some weird Christian stuff that works.
Oh yeah, no, he's all about the rapture.
So why do you think?
I always loved that. I love all the I am a supporter of Israel. They go, well, why do you support Israel? There, Mike. Well, the rapture. We need the rapture. Well, let me ask you a question, Mike. What happens to all the Jews in Israel when the rapture comes?
Who cares?
For that matter, what about the rest of us Jews? Yeah, he's like, we're out of here, buddy.
Listen,
I don't care. We float up to heaven straight out of our cars, which then drive over your children. It's like, we don't care.
I feel bad for laughing at the end, but that's, I always like it when you game these scenarios out. But yeah, they don't care. Who cares? It's a wager worth making, sir.
No, because he thinks he comes with a built-in, and he may, with a built-in machine, which is the evangelical Christians.
Yeah.
And the evangelical Christians have proven that they have zero Christian values. They are really a series of scams designed to promote corrupt preachers. And that's not to say there aren't a few out there who are, trying to do something virtuous, but there are a lot of them out there who are feathering their nests and doing so at the expense of the country, their flocks, our children, and our future.
No doubt about it. And we will continue talking about them and making fun of them whenever possible. Rothkopf, what is happening on Deep State Radio? What do you want to plug here at the end?
I don't want, people are interested in the kind of things that we talk about. They should go to the Deep State Radio. We got a bunch of new podcasts in the pipeline. So keep, watch this space. And we talk about foreign policy, national security, politics, health, science, and any area of policy. And what we try to do is have experts talk about it so you can get a little more depth than you would normally get on cable TV or even in most web-based news services. And we also try to have a little fun like we're doing here. So, we try to take the most important subjects in the world and not treat them as though they were boring.
Yes, and you know everybody, so you get the smartest people on and have these great panels. So go check it out if people haven't, and it's all linked in today's show notes. Deep State Radio, get the book, and thank you very much for joining me. I always love our talks. I look forward to them, and everybody loves when you join us. Thank you, sir.
I feel the same way, Pete. Hope to be back soon.
All right, there he goes, at DJ Rothkopf on Twitter. Go listen to Deep State Radio. Go get his book, American Resistance, the inside story of how the Deep State saved the nation. And that's all I've got for you today. Sorry again, I didn't get the news done today. I'll get back at it tomorrow, but I really appreciate you listening, pressing play, rating a review, signing up for a subscription. Can't do it without you guys. So grateful. And now let's let John Carroll take us out as he does each and every day. And I will talk to you right here tomorrow.
When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and